Hello students, this is Miss Dalton and this is video 8.4 for AQR, and this is designing a study. When you are designing a study, there are a certain number of steps that you want to go through. These steps are listed on page 128 through 129 in your textbook, and here are the steps. The first thing you want to do is you want to define the variables that you are measuring. Remember, these can be quantitative or they can be categorical. You want to identify the sample and the population that you are observing. You want to determine how you will collect the data. Will you do an experimental study? Will you do a survey? Or will it be observational? And then after collecting and analyzing the data in an observational study, the findings in the sample are used to draw conclusions about the population. Sample and population do not have to be people. So we're going to look at this first example, and I want you to try and write down what you think the variables are, who the sample is, and then what the population is. In order to see whether males and females differ in the amount of time they spend in a grocery store, you stand outside a supermarket and you record the time when every 10th person enters the store and the time when that same person exits. So some of the variables that you might write down is the gender, so the males versus the females, the time in the store. Maybe you're going to have a range of the time, so who spent 0 to 5 minutes, 6 to 10, so on and so forth. The sample is the people that you record, but the population is all the people going in and out of the store. So that sample you hope is representative of the population, but again, in this particular scenario, it's important to note that this sample is not representative of the population of all males and females. Okay, so that previous slide was specific for an observational study, and now let's look at designing a survey. So this is on page 130. Something that you want to do when you're designing a survey is the surveys attempt to measure samples without disturbing the samples by asking questions of a population and recording the data. Questions need to be written in a way that they will not sway the population. And then choosing an interviewer is just as important so they do not sway its population. Okay, now let's look at designing an experimental study. You can read page 131 in your textbook if you need more information on this. In an experimental study, the researcher manipulates the sample to provide answers to specific questions. You're going to determine a sample and a population in a non-biased way. Something is going to be manipulated to retrieve the data. The population is divided into groups. Random assignment divides the entire sample into groups, usually a control group and one or more treatment groups. And then you want pre-test measures, the variable of interest before an experiment begins, and post-test measures, the variable at the end of the experiment to look for changes or improvements. Go ahead and read through this scenario and then answer the 3 questions that are listed after it. One key thing to note about this scenario is that before they informed the workers about the experiment, the researchers secretly observed their productivity for 2 weeks. And so that gave them kind of a pre-test as to what their productivity was already like. Well, this was, after they did this though, then they informed the workers that they were going to be observing them. So the first question asks, what factors do you think could have caused the increased productivity? Well, one of the explanations is just that now they knew they were being observed, so they're going to work harder. There could be that the productivity increased because of the brightness of the lights. That is a factor. And then also the amount of break times, providing food during breaks, all of those are things that could have affected the productivity. Part B says, how could you improve the design of such an experiment? Well, one way would be to just not let the workers know that you're observing them. Something else that's listed here is that would be to inform workers but split them into 2 groups. And so then you could identify whether or not just the fact that they knew they were being observed had an effect on their productivity. Part C, what were the conclusions of the Hawthorne study? Research subjects may change their behavior because they know they are being observed. In this case, researchers concluded that workers felt they were being judged for their individual performances. This is now known as the Hawthorne effect. So you might have heard that, but we see it a lot, just even, when teachers are observed. Sometimes they put on a really great lesson that day because they know they're being observed. In this next example, we're going to identify some flaws in the experimental design. So I want you to read through this scenario and then go ahead and press play when you're ready to move on. Okay, after reading through this study, go ahead and read the yellow answers there on how this experiment could be looked at as being flawed. Okay, for this next slide, I want you to read through these true or false statements, and it might do you good to put these into your notes because you might see these again, and determine whether or not they're true or false. If they are false, explain why you say that they're false. When you're ready to check your answers, go ahead and press play. All right, for number 1, that is false. Random sampling is important for all studies. For number 2, that is true. Number 3, that is false. There's really no set number on the number of questions that you should have in a survey. Number 4 is false also. Only experimental studies manipulate a sample. Okay, same thing on this page. Go ahead and read through these scenarios and put whether you think they're true or false. Okay, number 5, that is false. The sample would be the days. Number 6, that is false. Random assignment and random sampling, they're very different. Number 7, that's false. The Hawthorne effect shows it's called that when they know that they're being watched. And then number 8, it is false. That is an example of random assignment, not random sampling. All right, last 2, go ahead and write down whether you think they are true or false, and then press play when you're ready to check your answers. Okay, number 9 is true. You cannot generalize those results from one gender to the next. And then number 10, variability, that is true because you're going to have lots of different times on how fast they can run, and so that's going to be a variable. All right, if you have any questions, please write them down. Make sure that you ask those questions in class, and some of these you might need to go back and read through the textbook. If you're not really sure, like for example, random sampling versus random assignment. So take this time to access the textbook in Moodle and get those definitions written down if you don't have them written down already.